Elmina Castle, one of the oldest and largest slave trading posts on the West African coast, particularly the coasts of Ghana, and was built by the Portuguese in 1482. It became a key holding area for enslaved Africans before they were shipped to the Americas. It was majorly built by the Portuguese to protect the gold trade. Elmina Castle later became a major center of the transatlantic slave trade. The Portuguese had begun exploring the West African coast for both trading and Christian missionary purposes in the 15th century. In 1471, they arrived at what was later called the Gold Coast. Finding a thriving gold trading economy, they established their own trading outpost, which was subsequently called Elmina, from the Portuguese de Costa da Elmina de Ouro, a translation for the coast of gold mines. Elmina Castle became the center of Portuguese trade on the Gold Coast, in present-day Ghana. At first, the Portuguese used it mainly for trading gold, but later it became an important place for trading enslaved Africans. Captured Africans from the interior of Africa were brought to Elmina Castle. From there, they were sold and shipped to Brazil and other Portuguese colonies in the Americas. In the 16th century, other European powers like the Dutch, British, and French became interested in the West African coast. The Dutch attacked Elmina Castle several times. In 1637, they finally defeated the Portuguese and took over the castle. Under Dutch control, Elmina became the main trading center on the Gold Coast. In the 1770s, the Dutch expanded and strengthened the castle. They even converted the castle's chapel into a slave auction room, where enslaved Africans were sold to the highest bidder. Elmina Castle had dark underground dungeons, where up to 200 slaves at a time were chained like animals, kept in horrible conditions while waiting to be shipped overseas. These dungeons still exist today as a reminder of the cruelty of the slave trade. In 1815, the Netherlands outlawed the slave trade. Later, in 1872, the British took control of Elmina Castle when the Gold Coast became a British colony. Cape Coast Castle, less than 10 miles from Elmina Castle, was also heavily used during this incredibly brutal chapter in history. Swedish traders constructed it in 1653, but after a few different owners, it fell under British control 11 years later. The castle's cannons pointed at the sea and kept other traders from venturing too close to the British-controlled castle. Many enslaved Africans passed through here on their way to British colonies in the Americas. Elmina Castle and Cape Coast Castle are just two of over 40 castles on this coast that held enslaved people on their way across the Atlantic Ocean. Around 30 still stand to this day, serving as a reminder of a period that humanity should never forget. Zanzibar slave market, an island off the coast of present-day Tanzania, was one of the most famous slave trade centers in East Africa. Slavery in Zanzibar lasted for many centuries and officially ended in 1909. The slave trade in Zanzibar began long before European involvement. For over 1,000 years, slavery existed in the region. The island was part of the Indian Ocean slave trade, where African slaves were taken from the East African coast and sold to Arab traders. Most of these slaves were transported across the Indian Ocean to places like Oman, Persia, present-day Iran, India, and even as far as China. Zanzibar became extremely important in the 18th and 19th centuries when the island developed large plantations of cloves and coconuts. These plantations needed cheap labor, and slaves provided it. At its peak, about 2/3 of the population in Zanzibar were slaves. Slaves were forced to work in terrible conditions on these plantations. Most slaves brought to Zanzibar came from the Swahili coast, modern-day Kenya, Tanzania, and Mozambique, Central Africa, areas around Congo and Malawi. These people were captured during wars, raids, or kidnapped from their villages. Slaves were kept in underground holding cells in Stone Town, the capital of Zanzibar. Conditions were horrific, overcrowded, dark and unsanitary. Slave markets operated openly, where buyers from Arabia, Persia, and India would purchase men, women, and children. Due to pressure from European powers, especially the British, the slave trade in Zanzibar was slowly reduced. In 1873, the British forced the Sultan of Zanzibar to close the slave market in Stone Town. However, slavery itself was not fully abolished until 1909. Today, visitors to Zanzibar can still see the remains of the old slave market, including the underground slave chambers and the memorial that stands in Stone Town. Whydah, also known as Whydah, was one of the largest and most important slave trading ports in West Africa. It was located in the Bight of Benin, in present-day Benin. In the early 1700s, Whydah became the main slave port in the transatlantic slave trade. Thousands of enslaved Africans were taken from here and shipped across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. At that time, Whydah was the capital of the old Whydah kingdom. Europeans called it Sabi, Savi or Javier. Many European countries, like the Portuguese, French, Dutch and British, set up trading posts in Whydah. The slave trade was the main business of the area, with people captured from nearby regions and sold to European traders. Whydah became known as the largest port where enslaved Africans were loaded onto slave ships heading to the Americas. In 1727, the powerful kingdom of Dahomey attacked and conquered Whydah. This caused a temporary decline in the slave trade. However, the port continued to operate and remained active in the slave trade business until the 1860s. Even after its decline, the name Whydah became famous around the world as a symbol of the transatlantic slave trade. Sofala, located on the southeastern African coast in present-day Mozambique, Sofala was one of the earliest trading ports. It was especially known for its connection to gold and later became involved in the slave trade. Sofala was probably the first African port in the southeast region to open up for trade with Europeans. In the 16th century, Portuguese traders frequently visited Sofala because of its close connection to the gold mines found inland. Interestingly, the slave trade in Sofala did not begin at the same time as its gold trade. It was only in the 19th century that Sofala became involved in the slave trade. After the suppression of the North Atlantic slave trade around 1815, slave traders began searching for new markets in East and Southeast Africa. This led to Sofala becoming one of the ports used to export enslaved Africans. From Sofala, slaves were mainly shipped to the New World, especially Brazil, other Portuguese colonies, islands in the Indian Ocean, Bagamoyo. The name Bagamoyo itself tells a sad story. It comes from the Swahili words Bagamoyo, which means lay down your heart or give up hope. This name reflected the pain and suffering of the enslaved people who knew they might never see their homes again. Bagamoyo was like a gateway of tears. It was the final stop for thousands of enslaved Africans who were captured from deep within Central Africa, from regions like present-day Congo, Rwanda, Burundi and parts of Tanzania. Slave traders forced them to walk for weeks or even months, barefoot, chained, starved and abused, all the way to Bagamoyo. Bagamoyo became a holding ground, a marketplace, where slaves were collected before being transported across the Indian Ocean. Bagamoyo worked hand in hand with the slave markets in Zanzibar. Slaves from Bagamoyo were often taken by boats to the island of Zanzibar, which became the center of the East African slave trade. From Zanzibar, wealthy Arab traders sold the slaves to buyers from Arabia, Persia, India and beyond. The slave trade in Bagamoyo officially ended in the late 19th century when European powers, especially the Germans and the British, abolished slavery in East Africa. Christian missionaries also set up churches and safe houses in Bagamoyo to rescue and educate freed slaves. Luanda, located in present-day Angola. Luanda was known as the slave trade port that fed Brazil's plantations. Located on the west coast of Central Africa, Luanda was one of the largest and most brutal slave trade centers controlled by the Portuguese. The Portuguese arrived in Luanda in 1575, led by explorer Paulo Dias de Novaes. They quickly built a fort called Fortaleza de São Miguel to protect their interests. While Luanda started as a trade center for goods like ivory and palm oil, it soon became clear that the most profitable trade was human lives. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Luanda had transformed into the main Portuguese slave port in Central Africa. Most of the enslaved Africans from Luanda were shipped across the Atlantic Ocean to Brazil, especially to sugar, coffee and tobacco plantations. The Caribbean, Portuguese colonies in South America. In fact, Luanda supplied almost half of the African slaves sent to Brazil during the Atlantic slave trade. African middlemen captured people from the interior regions, such as Congo, Ndongo, and surrounding kingdoms. They marched them to Luanda in chains, often after brutal tribal wars or raids. Slaves were then sold to Portuguese traders, branded with hot irons, and packed tightly onto slave ships. The journey across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage, was deadly. Many died before even reaching Brazil. Luanda's slave trade lasted for over 300 years. It's estimated that between 5 to 10 million Africans passed through Angola's ports, mainly Luanda, to work as slaves in Brazil and other parts of the Americas. The Portuguese made huge profits, building churches, forts and trading posts, while African societies were devastated, losing generations of their strongest men, women and children. Luanda became so tied to Brazil that some historians called it the Brazilian port in Africa. Even today, Angola and Brazil share cultural similarities in music, language, and religion, all rooted in this tragic history. The slave fort Fortaleza de São Miguel still stands in Luanda today as a reminder of this dark past. Goree Island, just off the coast of Dakar, Senegal, lies a small island with a very big and painful history, Gorée Island. Today it looks peaceful and beautiful, but hundreds of years ago, this small island was one of the most terrifying places for enslaved Africans. Gorée Island became one of West Africa's most notorious slave trade centers, and it is forever remembered for its most haunting landmark, the Door of No Return. Gorée Island was in the perfect location for European slave traders. Being right off the coast made it easy for ships to dock, load slaves, and set sail across the Atlantic Ocean. Between the 15th and 19th centuries, the island changed hands several times, controlled by the Portuguese, Dutch, French, and British, all of whom were heavily involved in the slave trade. The Door of No Return is perhaps the most symbolic and heartbreaking part of Gorée Island. It was a small, narrow doorway at the back of the Maison des Esclaves, House of Slaves, a building where enslaved Africans were kept. This door led straight to the ocean. Once a slave passed through this door, there was no coming back. It was their final step on African soil before being forced onto slave ships, never to see their family or homeland again. Slaves were brought from all over West Africa, captured during wars, raids, or kidnapped from villages. They were kept in tiny dark cells, separated by age, gender, and physical strength. Families were torn apart. Strong men, young women, and even children were sold like property. From the Door of No Return, they were forced onto ships bound for the Americas, especially to the Caribbean, Brazil, and the United States. The cells in the House of Slaves were so small that some rooms could barely fit 15 to 20 people, yet often held 100 or more at a time. Gorée Island became a symbol of human suffering, resistance, and survival. Today, many world leaders, including Nelson Mandela, Pope John Paul II, and Barack Obama, have visited the Door of No Return to pay their respects. Lagos. Long before British colonization, Lagos was one of West Africa's key centers for slave trading. It had a dark and painful history deeply connected to the transatlantic slave trade. Lagos, located along the coast of present-day Nigeria, was perfectly positioned for both inland and overseas slave trading. Slaves were captured from the hinterlands of Yoruba land and other surrounding areas. They were brought to Lagos, held in barracoons, slave-holding cells, and then sold to European slave traders. From there, they were shipped across the Atlantic to the Americas, the Caribbean, and Brazil. The ruling Obas, kings of Lagos, especially Oba Kosoko, played a powerful role in the slave trade. They collaborated with Portuguese, Spanish, and Brazilian slave merchants, exchanging enslaved people for guns, alcohol, fabrics, and other foreign goods. Slave traders from Europe would anchor their ships off the coast, and large numbers of African men, women, and children would be loaded onto these vessels, often under horrific conditions. By the mid-19th century, the British began to fight against the slave trade. In 1851, the British Navy bombarded Lagos in what became known as the Bombardment of Lagos, forcing an end to the rule of the pro-slavery Oba Kosoko. In 1861, Lagos officially became a British colony. From then on, efforts to end the slave trade intensified, though illegal slave trading continued secretly for some years. The Brazilian influence in Lagos today is a result of freed slaves returning from Brazil to settle in Lagos after the abolition of slavery. Many Afro-Brazilian families in Lagos trace their roots back to this dark era of slave trading. The district of Popo Aguda in Lagos Island still carries the cultural footprint of these returnees in their architecture, cuisine, and traditions.